Hey all y'all, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carrie. This is where I talk about knitting, my tips, my tricks, my opinions, and my preferences. If you've been watching my channel for any amount of time, you know that I am primarily a English style lover knitter. Say that 5 times fast. English style lover knitter, English style lover knitter. I did recently get a great question on how to efficiently do ribbing if you are a lover style or English style knitter. So today I'm going to share with you my top tips for knit purl combinations. So hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, give my video a thumbs up, and let's knit. In the description, I provide links to materials used in this video. To help support my channel, I do utilize affiliate links. All affiliate links are clearly indicated. For more information on affiliate links, please visit my website at knitswhereitsat.com. So knit purl combinations, ribbing, which is a knit purl combination at the end of the day, seed stitch, moss stitch. These stitch patterns involve moving the working yarn from the back of the work to the front of the work so that you can knit either knit stitches or purl stitches along the same row. The key to doing knit purl combinations without accidentally creating yarn overs is think of your needles like a gate, right? And each side of your needle, your left and your right needle, are like the posts of a gate, and you have your walkway that goes in between them, and the yarn needs to walk in between the posts of the gate. Very simple. This is not complicated. Unless you haven't done knit purl combinations before, and then you can feel a little flummoxed about the whole thing. I do love knitting English style, primarily as a lover knitter, and even I will admit, when it comes to one-by-one ribbing in particular, but ribbing in general and knit purl combinations, this is the type of stitch pattern where I got to admit, Continental knitting has a lot of advantages over English style knitting, and I will in fact show you why. So with Continental knitting, I take my right needle, I bring it forward to do a purl stitch, and that drags the yarn right along with it. And then I can just very quickly and easily do my 2 purl stitches. Oops, there we go. And then when I want to go back to do knit, I just bring my right needle back to the back of the work, and that drags the yarn with it. So it's very quick and efficient in Continental knitting to do knit purl combinations because you don't really have to physically move the yarn. You can just move your needle back and forth, and that's going to drag the yarn along with it. You should know that when I knit Continental, I do what's called combo knitting, and that means that I wrap my yarn clockwise when I purl and counterclockwise when I knit. And so I end up with stitches with both Eastern and Western mounts. And if you'd like to learn more about that, I have a whole video. My first knitting secrets revealed was understanding Western versus Eastern knitting. I will link it up here for you. If you find, as a Continental knitter, even moving the yarn back and forth is too much, or you just don't like knitting purl stitches in Continental, because let's face it, if you are still wrapping your yarn counterclockwise with doing purl stitches, doing the purl stitch is always a little trickier. Let's just put it that way. There's something else that you can do called a Norwegian purl, or a lazy purl. And the Norwegian purl or the lazy purl, you leave the yarn to the back of the work, so you don't move it at all. And all you have to do is you take your right needle and you bring it underneath the strand of yarn, and then you insert your needle into the stitches of the purl. But then it's like, well, how do I get to that? How do I get to that strand of yarn? Well, it's very easy. You take your right needle and you move it back towards that strand of yarn, grab it like this, and then you just pull it through. I'll show you again in slow motion. You can see I bring my right needle underneath the working yarn. I insert my needle into the first stitch on the left needle as if I'm going to purl. Then I move my right needle back to the right towards the working yarn. So that I can then use my right needle to catch the working yarn and wrap it around the needle. And I use my right needle to pull the working yarn back through the stitch. There are limitations to the Norwegian Purl. The big limitation is that it's not great if you're using yarns like cotton yarn or linen yarn. It's not great for that because you're really having to stretch that stitch. Which it's fine if you're working with like wool yarns, but if you're working with a linen or cotton or a less elastic, more slippery yarn, Norwegian Purl is not a great solution in those situations. But it's a nice little trick if you're a continental knitter to be able to use a Norwegian Purl. It's a neat little trick if you're a continental knitter, being able to do a Norwegian Purl. It's a nice little tool in the toolbox. So that is how you can do ribbing with continental knit purl combinations. And as you can see, there's a lot of options and it's very easy to do. And I will be the first one to admit that I will, especially with seed stitch more than anything else, even more than 1x1 rib, but whatever, I will switch to continental to do those stitch patterns. And if I'm starting off like, say, the rim of a hat or cuff of a sleeve, anything like that, or a sock, cuff of a sock, where I'm doing 1x1 ribbing to get going, I will sometimes, not always, but I will sometimes use continental knitting to do that 1x1 ribbing. And then when I get to the main part of the work, switch to English style knitting for the rest of it. Now, there are people who sit there and go, oh no, you shouldn't do that because of tension and engage. I personally have never had a problem. And, you know, there are no knitting police. I'm allowed to do what I want. I am the boss of my knitting. But this, by the way, is why I do think it is beneficial, no matter how you knit, to know more than one way to knit. Because sometimes stitch patterns lend themselves more easily to one style of knitting over another. And I am a big advocate for getting comfortable with knitting both English and continental so that you can choose the right tool from your toolbox. However, I still knit lever style knitting with knit purl combinations all the time, including 1x1 ribbing and seed stitch. It all just sort of depends on my mood. I'm gonna knit my first stitch, no big deal. Knit my second stitch, no big deal. Now I have to purl. In continental, I could just move my right needle back and forth and that would sort of drag the yarn along with it. However, in English knitting, my right hand is behind the needle and the yarn is being held and that yarn is not popping to the front the way it did continental. So with English style knitting, and this is true whether you're lever style knitting using a pencil grip like I am, or you use a knife grip, however you knit English style knitting, this is true, which is that you have to physically move the yarn from the back of the work to the front of the work. And you have to do it so that, again, you move in between the needles like that. So the way I kind of describe this is that you move your right hand almost as if you're going to wrap the stitch, but you don't. You just bring it to the front of the work in between the needles. And then you can do your purl stitches thusly. I'm going to now switch back to doing a knit stitch, and I'm going to do this again by physically moving the yarn from the front of the work to the back of the work. So I just take my right hand and I take the yarn and I move it in between the needles towards the back of the work, and now I'm set up to knit. So there's a lot of hand movement that goes on when you knit English style and you're doing knit purl combinations because you're, in addition to wrapping the yarn with your right hand, you are also having to have the added movement of moving your hand back and forth. And with 1x1 ribbing in particular, you are basically doubling the amount of times that you have to move your right hand. It's a lot more hand motion and it can kind of be annoying, I'm not gonna lie. And it definitely can feel like it takes longer to do ribbing as an English style knitter than a continental knitter. motions. That being said, I am a very proficient knitter, especially when it comes to lever style knitting. So my hand motion back and forth is very quick, and that comes with time and practice. However, I do have a small tip that can help build in a little bit more efficiency and a little bit more speed on doing knit purl combinations as an English style knitter. As an English style knitter, there's no Norwegian Purl. Physics is physics, and we cannot break the laws of physics. Even as knitters, we're bound by the laws of physics. So, but there is something you can do to make it a squidge more efficient. To understand this change, let's first look at how we do a purl stitch generally. So to do the purl stitch, my left needle comes over the top of my right needle in position 1. I move my left needle away from me to the back of the needle, around the tip of the needle to the back, and now my right needle is into this stitch, ready to be worked. So then I wrap my yarn, and now I bring my left needle back towards me to the front, and then I pull the left needle out of the stitch. That's how I do a purl stitch. And then I can move my yarn back if I need to. The way that you can add a little bit of efficiency, and this is such a subtle, small thing, you can actually take out a little motion when you are ready to move your yarn by not actually completing the stitch, which is what I do here. But what's happening is so quick, you probably can't see it, so let's slow this down. I'm just going to start doing my purl stitch as I would normally. Wrap the yarn, move my left needle back to the front of the needle, but I leave that left needle in the stitch, and then moving my yarn back to the back of the work pops the old stitch off the left needle. And I'm going to zoom in and slow this down more so you can really see how that stitch pops off the left needle as I move the yarn back. And so it's just one little less hand motion that I have to do. If I'm switching from doing a knit stitch to a purl, it's the same thing. I'm going to leave my left needle in the stitch, move the yarn to the front, and then that's going to pull this stitch that's now below off of the left needle. It's small. This is such a small sort of adjustment to make. And it might even seem like, does that really help speed things up? And it kind of does, because everything just becomes a little bit more fluid as you're working them, at least in my experience. And once you've trained yourself to do it this way, you won't even think about it. It'll just happen automatically. A lot of times when we do knit purl combinations, whether it's 1x1 ribbing, 2x2 ribbing, any kind of ribbing, or cable patterns, because oftentimes cable patterns are actually using knit purl combinations because the cables are on a purl background. A lot of times what happens is this stitch here that is to the right of a purl stitch oftentimes will look sloppy. You hear it all the time. Why does my 1x1 ribbing look sloppy? The reason that happens is when you are a Western style knitter, and this is true whether you are knitting Continental or you are knitting English style, the yarn starts off to the back of the work. You bring the yarn around the needle at the back of the work, comes around the needle counterclockwise, and then comes back to the back of the work. However, when you do a purl stitch, the yarn is here to the front of the work. In order to wrap the stitch, you need to bring the yarn back towards the back of the work, underneath the needle, and then back to the front again. And it's a longer stitch path, in essence. You're basically creating another half kind of turn in order to wrap that yarn. That little bit extra length to the yarn path means that you're using a little bit more yarn when you do a purl stitch than when you do a knit stitch. What can happen is that little bit of extra yarn creeps back up to the knit stitch on the right, and it makes a looser knit stitch here. And that's why it can look a little sloppier. One thing you can do to avoid that sloppy looking knit stitch in your ribbing is to try to remember to pull your yarn a little tighter when you're doing your purl stitches. However, if you're pulling your stitches tighter on your purl stitches, you are creating more strain on your hand when you're doing purl stitches, and I don't think that's necessary. Something though that you can do instead is to utilize combo knitting. Very situationally, utilize a Eastern mounted stitch. Eastern mounted stitches are stitches that are created by wrapping the yarn clockwise around the needle. If you knit your purl stitches Eastern style and your knit stitches Western style, the path the yarn takes on your purl stitches more closely matches the yarn path that it takes on your knit stitches, and then everything evens out very nicely. So here are my knit stitches. I'm going to knit as I would. I'm going to bring my yarn to the front, and this time, instead of wrapping my yarn counterclockwise, instead I'm going to wrap my yarn clockwise. So I'm going to take my yarn and I'm going to move it around the needle, bringing the yarn underneath, and finish my stitch. All I did differently was the direction I wrapped the yarn. Now, to do this trick, you only have to wrap the yarn clockwise on the first purl stitch. The second purl stitch, if you're doing a knit purl combination, you can wrap the yarn either way. You can wrap it clockwise or counterclockwise. I usually just go ahead and knit it counterclockwise at that point and continue on my merry way. So here's the first purl stitch at the knit purl junction. I'm going to wrap that one clockwise, and the next one I'll do regularly. So I wrapped my yarn clockwise on the first purl stitch of those purl columns as I went across. Let's look at what the result of that is, because this is important. So this is a knit stitch, and I come to this stitch and like, wait a minute, something doesn't look right. If you look here, this stitch, notice where the right leg is. The right leg is now behind the needle, and the left leg is in front of the needle. This is called the Eastern style mount. And this is what happens when you wrap your yarn clockwise around the needle. If you are not used to doing combo knitting or thinking about stitches being Eastern versus Western style, and all you've ever seen are Western mounted stitches, you might look at this and go, that's not sitting correctly, or that's wrong. It's not wrong, it's just different. But anyway, it's very simple what you do when you come to a stitch that is mounted this way with the right leg to the back of the needle. You bring your needle and you knit through the back loop, the back leg. That's the easy explanation of what you do. So whenever you see a stitch, and sometimes it just happens by accident, like you drop stitches and you put it back up on the needle and then it's turned the quote-unquote wrong way, where the right leg is to the back. All you have to do, you just knit through that back leg. So there you have it. I would love to hear your thoughts about doing ribbing either as a continental knitter or an English style knitter. What is your thoughts on 1x1 ribbing? Do you hate it? Do you avoid it at all costs? A lot of people do. A lot of people do. Because I will say, whether you knit English or continental, I do both. I will say 1x1 ribbing can be one of the more tedious feeling stitch patterns that are out there. What are your tips and tricks though for making ribbing more bearable? I'd love to hear your thoughts, your questions down in the description box. I hope that you enjoyed today's video. If so, please be sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with your knitting friends. Liking my videos, sharing my videos lets YouTube know that this is a space worth checking out, and it helps support my channel. Also, the best thing you can do to support my channel is hit subscribe and the notification bell. Hitting the notification bell lets you know whenever I upload a new video or I start a live stream. I do live stream most Sundays at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. If you'd like to follow me on social media, you can find all of that down in the description box below. And if I haven't said it already, thank you for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, evening, weekend, weeknight, whenever you may be watching this. And as always, happy health and happy knitting. Bye! Give my video a thumbs up and let's rib. Let's rib? That's so stupid. Let's rib. Oh. Let's rib. It's a dance. Do the rib. Do the rib. Do the rib, rib, rib. Do the rib. Anyway. So here I got my little swatch, 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 swatch. Splitty yarn, dealing with a splitty yarn. Feeling good. Wasn't so sure about this when I sat down. Yeah. I don't know. All right, that's it. We are done for the day.